The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Nebraska plains, driving snow sideways in sheets so thick that Margaret Sinclair could no longer see her own hands clutching the reins. The mare beneath her stumbled, its breath coming in ragged gasps that materialized as fleeting clouds before being torn away by the gale. She'd been a fool to leave Fort Laramie with winter closing in, but staying meant facing questions she couldn't answer. The telegram from Philadelphia still burned in her coat pocket, though the ink had long since blurred from melted snow. Her father was dead, the family fortune gone, and her engagement to William Hartley dissolved the moment news of the scandal reached Boston society. The mare's legs buckled. Margaret barely had time to kick free of the stirrups before the animal collapsed into a snowdrift, its sides heaving once, twice, then going still. She knelt beside it, her gloved fingers finding no pulse beneath the ice-crusted coat. "God help me," she whispered, though the words were snatched away instantly. She forced herself to stand, squinting through the white fury for any sign of shelter. Nothing, just the endless screaming white that seemed to erase the very earth beneath her feet. Her traveling dress, fine wool that had cost more than most folks saw in a year, was now a frozen shell that crackled with each movement. West. She'd been heading west when the storm hit, if she kept the wind at her back. But no, it was swirling now, coming from all directions. Her fingers were going numb inside her kid leather gloves. Her toes might as well not exist. Margaret stumbled forward, each step a monumental effort. Time lost meaning in the white void. She might have walked for minutes or hours. Her world narrowed to the next step, the next breath that burned like fire in her lungs. When she fell, she almost welcomed it. The snow was soft, inviting. They said freezing was like going to sleep. Peaceful. She'd read that in one of Father's books, back when she'd had a father, and books, and a warm library to read them in. A shadow moved through the white. Margaret blinked, certain she was seeing things. But no, there it was again. A shape, massive and dark, moving against the wind with purpose. Man or beast? She couldn't tell, but she forced her frozen lips to move. "Help!" The word came out as barely a croak. "Please!" The shadow changed direction, growing larger. A horse emerged from the storm, and atop it, a figure that seemed carved from the mountain itself. Broad shoulders wrapped in a buffalo coat, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, and Margaret found herself looking up at the tallest man she'd ever seen. Ice clung to his dark beard, but his eyes gray as the winter sky were sharp and immediate. "You hurt," his voice was deep, rough as tree bark. She tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering too hard. He didn't wait for a response, just scooped her up as if she weighed nothing at all. The heat coming off him was like a furnace, and she instinctively pressed closer. "Mare's dead," he said, more statement than question. "Saw it back there. City horse. Shouldn't have brought it out here." He lifted her onto his horse, a massive bay that stood steady as a rock despite the storm, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, creating a shelter of warmth and solid strength. "Got a place not far," he said against her ear. "Hold on." Margaret had no choice but to lean back against his chest as the horse moved forward with surprising confidence through the blinding snow. The man seemed to navigate by instinct alone, occasionally adjusting their direction as if following invisible landmarks. She must have dozed, or perhaps fainted, because the next thing she knew, they were stopped before a low structure that materialized from the storm, like something from a fairy tale. A cabin, built sturdy from thick logs, with smoke fighting its way from a stone chimney. The man dismounted and reached up for her. This time her legs wouldn't support her at all, and he simply carried her to the door, kicked it open, and brought her inside. Warmth hit her like a physical blow. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across a single room that was sparse but clean. A bed with a patchwork quilt occupied one corner, a rough table and chairs another. Shelves lined one wall, holding supplies and a few precious books. He set her in a chair near the fire and began working at her frozen boots with gentle efficiency. "These won't come off easy," he muttered. "Ice got 'em good." Margaret watched through a haze as he produced a knife and carefully cut the expensive leather away. Her stockings came next, and she saw with distant alarm that her toes were white as porcelain. "Frostbite," he said, but his hands were already working, rubbing her feet with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his massive frame. "Not too bad. You'll keep 'em." The pain, when feeling returned, was excruciating. Margaret bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, but didn't cry out. The man noticed anyway. "Hurts like hell, I know, but pain's good. Means they're coming back to life." He moved to her hands next, peeling away the ruined gloves. "What's a lady like you doing out here alone?" I was traveling to California." The lie came easily. "My guide abandoned me when the storm started." His gray eyes studied her for a long moment. No guide worth his salt abandons a client, especially not a woman. He didn't press further, just continued his ministrations. When he was satisfied that her extremities were no longer in danger, he stood and moved to the shelves. "Need to get you out of those wet clothes. I got a shirt and some pants that'll swim on you, but they're dry." He set the items on the table, then turned his back. "I'll see to my horse." Margaret's fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress, made clumsy by returning circulation. Everything was soaked through, even her corset and chemise. She struggled out of the wet garments with difficulty, her modesty warring with survival instinct. Finally, she stood naked before the fire for just a moment, letting the heat soak into her bones, before pulling on the offered clothes. The shirt fell nearly to her knees. The pants required rolling up several times. She must look ridiculous, but she was warm and dry, and that was all that mattered. The door opened with a blast of cold air as the man returned, stamping snow from his boots. His eyes took in her appearance, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his weathered features. "Better," he said simply. He hung his buffalo coat on a peg, revealing a frame that was indeed as solid as it had felt. "Hungry?" Margaret nodded, suddenly aware that she hadn't eaten since yesterday, the day before time had gotten away from her. He moved to the fireplace where a pot hung over the flames. The smell of stew made her stomach clench with hunger. He ladled out 2 bowls and set one before her with a hunk of rough bread. "It ain't fancy," he said, settling into the other chair. Margaret took a spoonful and nearly moaned. It was simple fare venison, potatoes, wild onions, but it tasted like ambrosia. "Thank you," she said when she could speak. "You saved my life." He shrugged. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Margaret said firmly. "They wouldn't have. I haven't even asked your name." "Jake McCready." He took a long pull from a cup of coffee that had appeared from somewhere. "You." Margaret Sin. She caught herself. "Margaret Smith." His lips quirked slightly. "Smith, common name." They ate in silence for a while, the storm rattling the windows. Finally, Jake spoke again. "Storm like this'll last days. You're stuck here, I'm afraid." Margaret looked around the single room, acutely aware of the single bed. I couldn't impose." "Ain't imposing if you got no choice." He stood, gathering the bowls. "Besides, been a long time since I had company." She watched him move about the cabin, noting the careful way he cleaned and stored everything. A man used to living alone, making do with what he had. "Mr. McCready." "Jake." "Jake." The informality felt strange on her tongue. "I should pay you for your trouble. When the storm clears, I can—" "Don't want your money." His voice was flat, final. "Then how can I repay you?" He turned from the shelf where he'd been arranging something, and his gray eyes held an expression she couldn't read. "You want to repay me?" He moved closer, and Margaret became acutely aware of how large he was, how the firelight played across his features. You'll warm my bed tonight, and I'll build you a ranch tomorrow." The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their directness. Margaret's face flamed, but before she could speak, he continued, "Not what you think. This storm's gonna get colder before it breaks. That fire won't last the night, and I got 1 bed and 2 blankets. We share warmth, or you freeze. Simple as that. And the ranch," his expression softened slightly. "Been planning to build one. Got the land, got the know-how, just never had a reason." He paused. "A woman like you, even dressed in my old clothes, you're running from something. Maybe you need a place to stop running to." Margaret's throat tightened. "You don't know me." "Know enough. Your tough made it through that storm longer than most men would have. You're proud trying to pay me back when you got nothing to pay with. And you're lost." He moved back to the fire, adding another log. "Maybe we're both lost." The wind screamed outside, emphasizing the fragile shelter of the cabin. Margaret pulled the too large shirt closer around herself, aware that she stood at a crossroads as surely as she had in that hotel room in Fort Laramie. "Just warmth," she said finally. "Nothing more." "Nothing more," he agreed, "unless you want it to be." As the night deepened and the storm raged on, Margaret found herself wondering what it would mean to stop running, to build something new in this harsh, unforgiving land. The man who'd saved her life stood by the fire, patient as the mountains, waiting for her to decide. Outside, the blizzard howled its fury, but inside the cabin there was warmth and shelter and the possibility of something more than mere survival. The storm raged for 4 days. Margaret woke each morning to find fresh snow pressed against the windows, the world outside erased in white. The first morning had been awkward, waking in Jake McCready's bed, his solid warmth at her back, his arm thrown protectively across her waist. True to his word, he'd been nothing but respectful, though she couldn't deny the comfort of his presence during the howling nights. "Coffee's on," Jake said from near the fire, his back turned as she stirred. It became their routine. He'd rise first, tend the fire, start coffee, giving her privacy to dress in the borrowed clothes that still swamped her frame. Margaret wrapped herself in the quilt and padded to the table. The coffee was black as sin and strong enough to float a horseshoe, but she'd grown to appreciate it. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked, watching him slice thick pieces of bacon. "This one's got teeth. Could be another day or 2. He glanced at her. "You in a hurry to leave?" The question caught her off guard. Was she? Where would she go? The vague plan of California seemed foolish now. A child's fantasy of starting over where nobody knew the Sinclair name or the scandal attached to it. "No," she admitted. "I suppose I'm not." Jake nodded and returned to his cooking. Margaret studied him in the morning light filtering through the frost-covered windows. He moved with an economy of motion, every gesture purposeful. His dark hair was shot through with premature silver at the temples, though she guessed him to be no more than 35. His hands, scarred and capable, spoke of years of hard work. After breakfast, the long day stretched before them. Jake busied himself with small repairs, mending harness, sharpening tools. Margaret discovered the books on his shelf, surprised by the selection. Shakespeare nestled next to agricultural guides, a worn Bible beside dime novels. "You read?" she asked, then flushed at the presumptuous question. "When the nights are long." He didn't look up from the leather he was working. "You're welcome to them." She selected a volume of poetry, Byron, and settled near the fire. But concentration proved difficult with Jake moving about the small space. She found herself watching him over the top of her book, noting the way he hummed tunelessly while he worked. How he'd pause occasionally to check the window, as if reading signs in the storm she couldn't see. "You play." She'd noticed a fiddle case tucked carefully in the corner. "Some," he seemed reluctant. "Haven't in a while." "Would you?" Margaret set aside her book. "I haven't heard music in a long time." Jake studied her for a moment, then retrieved the instrument. He spent several minutes tuning it, his face concentrated. When he finally drew the bow across the strings, the sound that emerged was sweeter than Margaret expected. He played a slow melody she didn't recognize, something mournful and beautiful that seemed to match the storm's mood. His eyes closed as he played, and Margaret saw a different man, younger, softer somehow. When the last note faded, she applauded softly. "That was lovely. What was it?" "Something my mother used to sing." He set the fiddle aside carefully. "Back in Tennessee, before a lot of things." His expression closed off, and Margaret knew better than to push. The afternoon wore on. They prepared lunch together, moving around each other in the small space with increasing ease. Jake showed her how to bank the fire properly, how to judge the wood's quality by its weight and sound. "You know a lot about surviving out here," she observed. "Learn or die." He added another log to the fire. "It's not a forgiving land. Yet you stay." "Where else would I go?" He turned to face her. "Back east, where they got rules for everything, where a man can't breathe without asking permission." "The East isn't all bad," Margaret said, thinking of Philadelphia's tree-lined streets, the library, afternoon teas with friends who'd turned their backs the moment scandal touched her family. "Maybe not for some." Jake's gray eyes were knowing. "But I'm guessing it wasn't too kind to you, or you wouldn't be out here dressed like that when I found you." Margaret looked down at her ruined traveling dress, now dry but salt-stained and torn. "No, it wasn't kind." That evening, as they shared another simple meal, the cabin felt smaller. The enforced intimacy was wearing on them both, or perhaps bringing them closer. Margaret couldn't tell which. "Tell me about this ranch," she said, desperate for conversation. "The one you plan to build." Jake's face transformed. He pushed his plate aside and began sketching on the rough table with his finger. "Got 600 acres up in a valley about 10 miles north. Sweetwater Creek runs through it, never goes dry. Grass stays green most of summer, protected from the worst of the winter winds by the hills." His voice warmed with enthusiasm. "Could run maybe 200 head to start, build up from there." "Why haven't you started?" He shrugged. "Man alone can only do so much. Besides," he trailed off. "Besides, what's the point of building something with no one to share it with, no one to leave it to?" The question hung between them. Margaret thought of the elaborate house in Philadelphia, empty now, sold to pay father's debts, all those rooms, all that space. And in the end, it had meant nothing. "You never married?" she asked softly. "Once, long time ago." Jake stood abruptly, moving to the window. "Cholera took her and the baby. That was back in Missouri." "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," he repeated. That night, as they lay in careful separation in the dark, Margaret spoke into the silence. "My father killed himself." The words came out in a rush. "He'd been embezzling from his bank. When they found out, he took his pistol and—" She couldn't finish. Jake's hand found hers under the covers, his calloused palm warm and steady. "My fiancé broke our engagement the next day," she continued. "Said he couldn't align himself with scandal. Everyone I thought was my friend. They all just disappeared." "Their loss," Jake said simply. "So I ran, took what little money was left and ran. Thought I could start over in California, but—" She laughed bitterly. "I don't even know what I thought I'd do there." "Sometimes running's all we got." His thumb stroked across her knuckles. "Until we find a reason to stop." The third day brought a brief respite in the storm. Jake ventured out to check on his horse and bring in more wood. Margaret used the time to tidy the cabin, finding unexpected satisfaction in the simple domesticity. She discovered his cache of preserves and decided to attempt something more elaborate for dinner. When Jake returned, stamping snow from his boots, he stopped short at the smell of baking. "Biscuits," Margaret said, suddenly shy. "I found your sourdough starter. I hope you don't mind." "Mind." He hung up his coat, a smile playing at his lips. "Woman, I haven't had proper biscuits in 2 years." They were slightly lopsided and perhaps a bit too brown on the bottom, but Jake ate 4 of them with every evidence of enjoyment. "You can cook," he said with evident surprise. "I had to learn something during those interminable finishing school years." Margaret found herself smiling. "Though I'll admit, cooking on a wood stove is different from our kitchen range at home." "You did good." He caught her hand as she reached for his empty plate. "Real good." The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her. Margaret pulled away, confused by her reaction. This was a business arrangement. Nothing more, shelter from the storm. A possible future that didn't involve servitude or shame. Nothing more. That night, the temperature plummeted, even with the fire built up. Cold seeped through every crack in the cabin walls. Margaret shivered despite the quilts, her teeth chattering. "Come here," Jake said roughly. "No point in being prideful and freezing." She scooted back against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, cocooning her in warmth. Margaret tried to stay stiff, maintaining some distance, but her body betrayed her, relaxing into his solid presence. "Better." His breath stirred her hair. "Yes." It came out as barely a whisper. "Margaret." The way he said her name made her shiver for entirely different reasons. "That ranch I mentioned, I meant it. It's no kind of life for a woman alone out here, but together—" "Jake, you don't know me. Not really." "I know you've got steel in your spine. No, you don't quit easy. No, you can make something out of nothing. Those biscuits proved that." His arms tightened slightly. "No, you're running from something that wasn't your fault. And if I'm not what you think, if I'm too soft, too Eastern, then we'll figure it out as we go." He paused. "If you're willing to try." Margaret closed her eyes, seeing again that valley he'd described. A house not grand like the one she'd lost, but solid and real. Cattle grazing in green grass, children, maybe, laughing in the yard. A life built on truth instead of society's facades. "I don't love you," she said carefully. "Don't love you either," he replied. "But there's something here. Could be something more, given time." The 4th morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm finally spent. Margaret stood at the window, watching sun sparkle on fresh snow, and made her decision. The sun was barely past dawn when Jake saddled his horse, a sturdy bay he called Ranger. Margaret stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of his blankets, watching him work. The storm had left everything transformed, familiar landmarks buried under pristine white. The world made new and strange. "Are you sure you want to see it today?" Jake asked, checking the cinch. "Snow's deep. Might be rough going." "I'm sure." Margaret had made her decision during the long night, feeling the solid warmth of him behind her. If she was going to bind her life to his, she needed to see this dream of his, this valley that would become her home. Jake had managed to cobble together riding clothes for her, an old pair of his pants taken in with rough stitches, boots that had belonged to someone smaller, maybe that wife he'd mentioned so briefly. Margaret mounted behind him, arms wrapped around his waist, and they set off into the glittering morning. The journey took longer than it might have without the snow. Jake picked their path carefully, occasionally dismounting to lead Ranger through deeper drifts. Margaret used the time to study the landscape, so different from Pennsylvania's gentle hills. Here, the land stretched endlessly, broken by stands of pine and cottonwood, by ridges of red rock that rose like ancient bones from the earth. "There," Jake said finally, reining in at the crest of a rise. "That's it." Margaret's breath caught. Below them spread a valley perhaps 3 miles long and half as wide, sheltered by protecting hills. A creek wound through it like a silver ribbon, lined with trees that would be green come spring, even under snow. She could see the potential, the gentle slopes perfect for grazing, the level areas where buildings could stand, the natural windbreaks formed by the hills. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. Jake dismounted and helped her down, keeping her hand in his as they stood looking over the land. "House would go there," he said, pointing to a rise near the creek but above any flood line. "Barn there. Could dam part of the creek. Make a pond for watering stock." His voice grew animated, painting pictures with words. "Plant some apple trees, they do well in this soil. Garden for vegetables. Maybe someday a school, if other families settle nearby." "A school?" Margaret looked at him in surprise. His ears reddened slightly. "For the children. Someday." The implication hung between them. Children meant marriage, meant a real life together, not just a business arrangement born of desperation and storm. "Show me where the house would be." Margaret said, "Exactly." They remounted and picked their way down into the valley. Up close, it was even better than from above. The creek sang under its coating of ice, promising fresh water year-round. The soil, where Jake kicked away snow to show her, was dark and rich. Tall pines would provide timber for building and shelter from winter winds. Jake led her to a level spot overlooking the creek, sheltered by a curve of hill. "Here," he said. "Face it east to catch morning sun. Big windows glasses, dear, but worth it to see the sunrise." Margaret walked the imaginary rooms, envisioning walls and doors. "Kitchen here," she said, getting into the spirit. "To catch the morning light. Parlor there, bedrooms along this side." "Big kitchen," Jake agreed. "Heart of a ranch house, maybe a covered porch all around, for summer evenings. And roses," Margaret added impulsively. "I'll plant roses by the door." "Roses?" Jake looked skeptical. "This ain't Philadelphia. Wind and cold would kill them." "Prairie roses, then wild ones. I've seen them growing in impossible places." She turned to face him. "If I'm going to make a life here, I want something beautiful, something that's just for joy, not survival." Jake studied her for a long moment. "Fair enough. Prairie roses it is." They spent hours walking the land, Jake showing her every feature, the best grazing areas, the spots where deer came to drink, the grove of cottonwoods that would provide shade in summer. Margaret found herself catching his enthusiasm, seeing not the empty land, but what it could become. "How long to build a house?" she asked as they paused to rest the horse. "Depends. Basic structure. Maybe 2 months with help. Neighbors usually come together for house raisings. But to finish it proper," he shrugged, "could take a year or more, working around ranch duties." "Where would we live meanwhile?" "Start with a soddy or a dugout. Not fancy, but warm enough." He must have seen her expression because he added quickly, "It's not forever. Just until we get established." A soddy? Margaret had heard of them, houses made of stacked prairie sod. Dirt homes, essentially. A far cry from her childhood bedroom with its silk wallpaper and 4-poster bed. But then, that bedroom was gone now. Sold with everything else to pay her father's debts. "I can do it," she said, as much to herself as to him. "Never doubted it." Jake's hand found hers. "You're tougher than you look. Margaret Smith." She laughed at the false name. "Sinclair. My real name is Margaret Sinclair." "Figured as much. Heard about that bank business, even out here." He squeezed her hand. "Doesn't matter. Out here, you are who you choose to be." They ate lunch by the creek, sharing bread and dried beef from Jake's saddlebags. The sun climbed higher, warming the air enough that Margaret could push back her borrowed coat. "Tell me about the cattle," she said. "How does it work?" Jake's face lit up. He was a natural teacher, she discovered, patient with her ignorance and clear in his explanations. He told her about the Texas Longhorns, tough as nails and able to survive on sparse feed. About the roundups and branding, the long drives to market, the careful breeding to improve the stock. "It's hard work," he warned. "Up before dawn, in the saddle all day. Calving season means no sleep for weeks, and always the weather to fight drought, blizzards, floods." "But you love it." "I do. He looked out over the valley. There's something about building a thing from nothing. Watching the grass come back each spring, seeing new calves drop, knowing every acre because you've ridden it 100 times. In Philadelphia, I spent my days paying calls and planning dinner parties, Margaret said. I embroidered samplers I never looked at again and practiced piano pieces to show off in parlors. None of it meant anything. This means something, Jake said simply. Every fence post, every calf branded, every harvest, it all builds towards something real. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they reluctantly headed back. Margaret rode behind Jake again, but this time she noticed things she'd missed on the morning journey: a hawk circling against the pale sky, the track of rabbits in the snow, the way the light turned the mountains purple and gold. "Jake," she said as they neared his cabin. "What if I fail? What if I can't do this?" He reined in and twisted to look at her. "What if you don't? What if you turn out to be the best rancher's wife in the territory?" Wife? The word sat strange on her tongue. Is that what I'd be? If you're willing, can't build a life together without making it legal. Besides, his gray eyes crinkled with rare humor, folks talk enough without giving them extra ammunition. When? Soon as we can get to town. Storm's broken. Should be able to make it in a few days. Get you some proper clothes, supplies for building. Make it official. Margaret's heart hammered. In a few days, she could be married to this man she barely knew, committed to a life she could scarcely imagine. But what was the alternative? Return east to face the whispers and closed doors, try to reach California with no money and no plan. All right, she said. We'll go to town. That evening, as Margaret prepared their simple supper, she found herself humming. It had been months since music had risen unbidden to her lips. Jake noticed, smiling as he mended a bridle. Happy? He asked. Terrified, she admitted. But also, yes, happy, or at least hopeful. Hope's enough to start with. He set aside his work. Margaret, I want you to know this marriage. It can be whatever we make it. I won't, that is, I don't expect. She understood his fumbling and was touched by it. I know. We'll figure it out as we go. Like you said. After supper, Jake brought out his fiddle again. This time the tunes were livelier jigs and reels that had Margaret's feet tapping. When he started a waltz, she stood impulsively and held out her hand. Dance with me. Here now. Why not? We're going to be married. Surely we can share a dance. Jake set aside the fiddle and stood, taking her hand with unexpected grace. Without music. They waltzed around the small cabin, navigating furniture and laughing when they bumped into things. Jake hummed the melody, and Margaret found herself relaxing into his lead. Where'd a rancher learn to waltz? She asked. Tennessee, before the war. My mother insisted all her boys learn proper. His hand at her waist was warm and steady. Never thought I'd use it again. They slowed, swaying more than dancing. And Margaret realized she didn't want to let go. This man, this stranger who'd saved her life, was offering her a future. Not the one she'd planned in her Philadelphia drawing room, but maybe something better, something real. Jake! That first night, when you said I'd warm your bed and you'd build me a ranch, did you mean it the way it sounded? He stopped dancing, looking down at her with those steady gray eyes. Meant it as an offer. A trade, if you want to see it that way. Companionship and partnership for a home and a life. But also meant it as a hope that maybe, given time, it could be more than a trade. His hand came up to cup her cheek. I'm not a man of pretty words, Margaret, but I know loneliness, and I see it in you too. Maybe together we can build something better than either of us would have alone. Margaret leaned into his touch. Closing her eyes, tomorrow would bring the journey to town, the legal bonds, the beginning of a life she couldn't quite envision. But tonight, in this simple cabin with this complicated man, She felt the first stirrings of something that might, someday, become love. "Show me the stars," she said impulsively. "In Philadelphia, the gas lights hid them. I want to see them all." Jake smiled and fetched her coat. Outside, the night was crystal clear, the sky a vast canvas of light. Jake pointed out constellations, the hunter, the bear, the 7 sisters. His arm around her shoulders was warm and solid, an anchor in all that immensity. "Beautiful," Margaret breathed. "Wait until summer." Jake said, "Out in that valley, with no walls around you, it's like you could reach up and touch them." Standing there in the snow, under the infinite sky, Margaret made her choice with her whole heart. Not just to survive, but to live, to build, to hope. Tomorrow, she would become Margaret McCready, rancher's wife. Tonight, she was just a woman under the stars, daring to believe in new beginnings. The town of Cedar Falls appeared like a mirage after 2 days of hard riding. Margaret, now dressed in a proper riding skirt Jake had purchased from a neighboring ranch, still felt like she was playing a role in someone else's life. They'd been married 3 days now, the ceremony brief and businesslike in the judge's parlor, witnessed by his wife and a clerk who smelled of whiskey. "Need to stop at Morrison's for supplies," Jake said as they rode down the main street. "Then the land office." Margaret nodded, trying not to stare at the women they passed. Some were clearly ranchers' wives, like herself, or what she was trying to become, dressed in practical calico and sunbonnets. But there was another woman across the street, standing outside the hotel, wearing a dress of emerald silk that would have been at home in Philadelphia's finest establishments. The woman was beautiful in a polished way. Margaret recognized every hair in place, despite the prairie wind. Gloves, pristine white, her parasol angled just so. She was talking to a man in a banker's suit, laughing at something he said, her hand touching his arm with practiced grace. Jake had seen her too. His face didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "Morning, Jake," the woman called out, her voice carrying like honey over glass. "Victoria." Jake touched his hat brim briefly, not slowing Ranger's pace. But Victoria, that was her name, wasn't so easily dismissed. She left her companion and glided across the street, somehow avoiding the mud and horse droppings without seeming to look where she stepped. "My goodness, Jake McCready. Is that a wedding ring I see?" Her green eyes fixed on Margaret with sharp interest. "And this must be your bride. How unexpected." "Margaret, this is Victoria Ashford," Jake said, his voice carefully neutral. "Victoria, my wife." "Charmed." Victoria's smile was perfect and cold. "What a brave little thing you must be, taking on ranch life. It's so very different from civilization." Margaret felt her spine stiffen. She knew this game, had played it in a dozen Philadelphia drawing rooms. "I find the honesty of ranch life refreshing," she said, matching Victoria's honeyed tone, so much more genuine than the artifice of city society. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed, though I do hope Jake warned you about the isolation. Why, at the Weatherby Ranch, poor Ellen didn't see another woman for 6 months. She was quite changed by the experience." "I'm sure Margaret will manage fine." Jake cut in. "We need to be going." "Of course." Victoria's hand touched Jake's boot in the stirrup, a gesture too familiar for casual acquaintance. "Do bring your bride to the church social Saturday. Everyone's dying to meet the woman who finally caught Jake McCready." As they rode on, Margaret kept her silence until they were inside Morrison's general store, while Jake spoke with the proprietor about credit and supplies. She pretended to examine bolts of cloth, her mind churning. "Find something you like." Margaret startled. An older woman stood beside her, worn but kind-faced, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "I'm Sarah Morrison," the woman said. "Tom's wife. You must be Jake's bride." "Margaret McCready." The name still felt foreign. "Yes, we married 3 days ago." Sarah's face softened. Don't let Victoria Ashford rattle you. Dear, she's had her cap set for Jake these 2 years, ever since her husband died and left her that hotel. Some women don't take kindly to losing. She's very beautiful. Beautiful as a diamond and just as hard. Sarah pulled out a bolt of blue calico. This would suit you. Practical but pretty. That's what you need out here, things that work, but don't make you forget you're a woman. Margaret fingered the fabric, grateful for the kindness. Were she and Jake? He courted her for a time, maybe 6 months back, but Jake's got more sense than some give him credit for. He saw what was under all that polish. Sarah lowered her voice. She wanted the idea of him strong, handsome rancher to parade around, but when she found out about the hard work of actually building a ranch, well, I see. Do you? Sarah studied her shrewdly. Because that woman's not going to give up easy. She's got money, connections, and time. You've got Jake's ring and his name, but you'll need more than that. Before Margaret could ask what she meant, Jake appeared with Tom Morrison, the two men shaking hands over what seemed to be a substantial credit arrangement. Got what we need ordered. Jake told her, be delivered to the ranch in 2 weeks. Ready. Margaret selected several bolts of fabric, some thread and needles, and, on impulse, a packet of flower seeds. Prairie rose seeds, she told Jake with a small smile. He smiled back, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him since encountering Victoria. Good. Let's get them recorded at the land office, then head home. But as they left the store, Victoria was there again, this time with 2 other women who looked like prettier versions of vultures in their dark dresses and eager expressions. Mrs. Macready, Victoria said with false warmth. I was just telling Mrs. Powell and Mrs. Clement about your romantic story. Rescued from a blizzard, how thrilling. Jake saved my life, Margaret said simply. I was very fortunate. Oh, but to marry so quickly, Mrs. Powell tittered. Why, you barely knew each other. Sometimes you recognize what's right, Jake said, his hand coming to rest on Margaret's back. Don't need months of dancing around it. How practical, Victoria murmured. Though I do hope you knew what you were getting. Margaret, ranch life can be so very hard on a woman. Why, just last year, the Thornton bride, you remember her, Jake, that pretty little thing from St. Louis. She lasted barely 4 months before running back east. Margaret's not running anywhere, Jake said flatly. Of course not. Not yet. Victoria's smile was razor sharp. Do bring her to the social. Jake, I'll introduce her to everyone. We're all so curious about your background. Margaret, you have such refined manners. Were you a governess, perhaps, or a companion? The insult was subtle, but clear Victoria was suggesting Margaret was little better than a servant. Margaret felt Jake tense beside her, but she pressed his arm gently. Neither, she said calmly. Though I admire women who must make their own way in the world, it takes such courage to work for one's living when widowed. So much more admirable than those who simply inherit. Victoria's face flushed. Her hotel had indeed come from her late husband, a fact she preferred people forget. We'll be at the social, Margaret continued. I look forward to meeting everyone. Community is so important. Don't you think everyone supporting each other, celebrating successes, helping through hardships, that's what makes the difference between surviving and thriving? She turned to Jake. Shall we finish our business? I'm eager to get home and start planning where to put my roses. As they walked away, Margaret could feel Victoria's glare burning into her back. At the land office, Jake was quiet as he recorded the marriage certificate and updated the deed to include her name. You handled that well, he said finally as they mounted up to leave town. I've dealt with women like Victoria before. They exist in every society, whether it's a Philadelphia ballroom or a frontier town. She wasn't wrong, though, about it being hard, about women leaving. Margaret looked at him steadily. I'm not the Thornton bride. Jake, I'm not here because I have romantic notions about ranch life. I'm here because I choose to be. Even after seeing what you're up against, Victoria won't let up. She'll make sure every woman in the county knows you're an outsider, that you don't belong. Then I'll have to prove her wrong." Margaret surprised herself with the steel in her voice. "I've lost everything once. Jake, I won't be driven off by a woman in silk gloves who thinks she has a claim on you." Something flickered in Jake's eyes. "Is that what this is about, jealousy?" The question stung. "No, it's about respect. It's about building something real while she plays society games. It's about—" Margaret stopped, realizing with surprise that it actually was, at least partly, about jealousy. The thought of Jake with Victoria, of those manicured hands touching him, made something hot and possessive rise in her chest. "It's about being your wife," she finished more quietly. "Maybe I don't love you yet, Jake McCready, but you're mine now, and I protect what's mine." Jake reined in Ranger, studying her with those unreadable gray eyes. Then, to her surprise, he laughed a rough, genuine sound she'd rarely heard from him. "God help me. I think I chose better than I knew," he said. "All right, Margaret McCready, we'll go to that social, and you'll show them all what a Philadelphia lady looks like when she decides to fight." They rode home in comfortable silence, but Margaret's mind was already working. She'd need a dress nothing as fancy as Victoria's silks, but something that showed she knew quality. She'd use some of the calico Sarah had recommended, maybe add some touches of lace from one of her ruined traveling dresses. More importantly, she'd need to start building alliances. Sarah Morrison seemed kind. That was a start. There must be other women, ranchers' wives, who'd value substance over style. She'd learned in Philadelphia that the real power often lay not with the most beautiful or wealthy, but with those who understood community. That night, as she prepared supper in the cabin that was now home, Margaret found herself humming again. Jake noticed, smiling from where he was cleaning his rifle. "Planning your campaign." "Perhaps," she set a plate before him. "Tell me about the other ranchers. Who matters who leads?" Jake's approval was evident as he began sketching out the social landscape of Cedar Falls. By the time they retired, Margaret had a mental map of potential friends and certain enemies. As she lay beside Jake in the dark, feeling the now familiar warmth of him, Margaret spoke softly. "She's in love with you, Victoria." "No," Jake said after a pause. "She's in love with what she thought she could make me into. There's a difference." "And what am I trying to make you into?" His hand found hers under the quilts. "Nothing. You're taking me as I am. That's new." Margaret squeezed his fingers. "Then take me as I am too, jealous, proud, and determined not to let anyone drive me off land that has my name on it now." "I can do that," Jake murmured. And in the darkness, Margaret could hear his smile. Saturday would come soon enough, bringing with it all the challenges Victoria Ashford could muster. But tonight, Margaret McCready was exactly where she chose to be, beside her husband, under the vast prairie sky, building something worth fighting for. The church social had gone better than Margaret expected. She'd won over several ranchers' wives with her genuine interest in their lives. And even Victoria's barbed comments had lost some sting when Sarah Morrison publicly praised Margaret's apple pie. Jake had seemed proud, his hand warm on her back as they danced to the fiddle music. That was 2 weeks ago. Now, as Margaret worked in the garden plot she'd carved out near the cabin, she felt something approaching contentment. The prairie rose seeds were planted, though it would be months before she'd know if they took. The foundation for their new house was marked out, waiting for the timber delivery. Margaret. She looked up to find Jake standing awkwardly by the garden fence, a letter in his hand. His face was strange pale beneath his tan, his jaw set hard. "What is it?" She rose, brushing dirt from her hands. Letter came with the supply wagon. He held it out, and she saw her married name written on the envelope. From Philadelphia. Margaret's heart sank. She'd written to her father's lawyer after the wedding, informing him of her new situation and asking him to forward any remaining correspondence. She hadn't expected a response so soon. Inside the cabin, she broke the seal with trembling fingers. Jake hovered nearby, clearly torn between giving her privacy and wanting to offer support. The letter was brief, businesslike. The lawyer informed her that in settling her father's estate, certain irregularities had come to light. Documents suggested that Charles Sinclair had not acted alone in his embezzlement. There was evidence pointing to an associate, someone who'd helped move the stolen funds. "My God," Margaret whispered, sinking into a chair. "What is it?" She handed him the letter, watching his face darken as he read. "This associate," Jake said slowly. "They have a name." "No, but Jake." She met his eyes. "What if they think it was me? What if they think I helped him?" "You were back east when we married. If they suspected you, they'd have stopped you leaving. But now they're investigating further. What if—" Her voice broke. "What if they come here? What if this follows me even here?" Jake set the letter aside and knelt before her chair, taking her hands. "Then we face it together. That's what marriage means." But the damage was done. The peace Margaret had begun to feel shattered like spring ice. Over the following days, she jumped at every sound, expecting to see lawmen riding up with warrants. She barely slept, lying rigid beside Jake, wondering if she'd brought disaster to his door. "You need to tell me," Jake said one evening as she pushed food around her plate. "All of it. Everything you knew about your father's business." So she did. How her father had grown increasingly secretive in his final months. The late-night meetings with men she didn't recognize. The way he'd snap at questions about the bank. She'd thought it was the pressure of business. Nothing more. "There was one man," she said slowly, memory surfacing. "He came to the house several times. Father always sent me away when he arrived. Samuel Crane, I think his name was." Jake's head came up sharply. "Crane, thin fellow, scar on his left cheek." "You know him." "Know of him." Jake's voice was grim. "He passes through here sometimes. Calls himself a cattle buyer, but everyone knows he's really moving money for folks who can't use banks. If he was mixed up with your father—" "Oh, God." Margaret buried her face in her hands. "It is my fault. I brought this here." "Stop that!" Jake pulled her hands down, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You didn't know, and we don't know for certain he was involved." But 3 days later, their worst fears materialized. Margaret was hanging washing when she saw riders approaching 3 men in dark coats despite the warm day. Her heart hammered as she recognized the one in the lead. Samuel Crane looked exactly as she remembered, down to the scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. "Mrs. Sinclair," he called, dismounting with casual arrogance. "Or should I say Mrs. McCready? Imagine my surprise, hearing you'd married out here. In Mr. Crane." She kept her voice steady through sheer will. "What brings you to our ranch?" "Business, of course. Your late father and I had arrangements, certain matters that remain unsettled." Jake appeared from the barn, rifle held casually but ready. "Gentlemen, something I can help you with." "Jake McCready." Crane's smile was cold. "The lady and I are old acquaintances. Her father and I were partners of a sort." "Were?" Jake moved closer to Margaret. "Man's dead. Any business died with him." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong." Crane pulled out a leather portfolio. "See, Charles Sinclair was holding something for me when he had his accident. $20,000, to be precise. Money that seems to have vanished along with everything else." "My father stole from his own bank," Margaret said, finding her voice. "If you were foolish enough to trust him with money, that's your misfortune." Crane's eyes glittered dangerously. "Maybe so. But see, I think his devoted daughter might know where he hid my funds. Maybe even has them herself. How else does a ruined woman afford to travel west? Set up housekeeping. Get off our land." Jake said quietly. Our land, Crane laughed. From what I hear, this spreads mortgage to the hilt. One word from me to the right people, and the bank might just call that note early. Then where will you be? Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. They'd leveraged everything for supplies, for lumber, for the start of their herd. If the bank demanded immediate payment, You're threatening my wife, Jake said, and there was something deadly in his calm. Threatening? Crane spread his hands innocently. Just laying out facts. But I'm reasonable. The lady helps me recover my property, and I've got no quarrel with either of you. I don't know anything about your money, Margaret said desperately. Father never spoke of you except... She stopped, remembering. Except... The night before, he died. He gave me a small case, told me to keep it safe, but it only had family papers, birth certificates, mother's jewelry. Crane leaned forward eagerly. This case, you still have it. Margaret glanced at Jake, who nodded slightly. Inside, I'll get it. She returned with the leather case she'd carried west, one of the few possessions that had survived the journey. Crane snatched it, pawing through the contents with growing frustration. Papers, he snarled. Worthless papers and paste jewelry. I told you. Wait. One of Crane's men pointed at the case itself. The lining's been altered. See there? Crane ripped at the silk lining, revealing a hidden pocket. Inside were several documents Margaret had never seen: bank drafts, transfer orders, and what looked like a coded ledger. Well, Crane's smile was triumphant. Seems the devoted daughter knew more than she claimed. I didn't know, Margaret whispered. I swear I didn't know. Doesn't matter now. Crane tucked the documents inside his coat. These should help me recover what's mine. Pleasure doing business with you. Mrs. McCready? He turned to go, then paused. Oh, and Jake, you might want to keep a closer eye on your wife. Woman who'd helped steal from her own father's bank. Well, who knows what else she might do. After they'd gone, Margaret stood frozen in the yard, the empty case hanging from her numb fingers. Jake approached slowly, as if she were a spooked horse. Margaret. He's right. Her voice was hollow. I did know. Some part of me must have known something was wrong. All those signs, and I chose not to see. You were trying to protect your father. And now I've brought his sins here. To you. To our life. She looked at him with swimming eyes. How can you stand to look at me? Jake took the case from her hands, setting it aside. Then he pulled her against his chest, holding her as she shook. Because you're my wife, he said simply. Because whatever you knew or didn't know, you're not your father. Because we've all got things in our past we'd rather forget. Your past didn't just threaten our future. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then, you sure about that? Margaret pulled back to look at him. His face was grim, older suddenly. There's things I haven't told you either, he said, about why I left Tennessee, about what I did during the war. You want to trade confessions. Margaret, because mine might be worse than yours. She studied his weathered face, seeing new shadows there. Tell me. Not now, not like this. He touched her cheek gently. But soon, for now, we need to figure out how to protect what we're building. Crane got what he wanted, but he's not the type to leave well enough alone. He'll be back. That night, as they lay sleepless in the dark, Margaret voiced the fear that had been growing since Crane's visit. What if this is a mistake, us? What if we're both too damaged, carrying too much past? Jake's hand found hers. Maybe that's why we fit. Two people with perfect pasts wouldn't understand each other the way we do. I don't want my past to destroy your future. Our future, he corrected. And it won't, we won't let it. But as Margaret stared into the darkness, she wondered if determination was enough. Crane knew where they were now, knew their vulnerabilities. And Jake's own unspoken secrets waited like shadows at the edge of their fragile new happiness. She'd thought the prairie was a place to start fresh, but she was learning that the past had long arms. It could find you anywhere, even in a cabin beneath the endless sky, even in the arms of a man who promised to stand between you and whatever came. The rose seeds she'd planted seemed like foolish optimism now. What was the point of planting beauty in a place where ugly truths could ride up any day and tear everything apart? But when Jake's arms tightened around her, when he murmured her name like a promise in the dark, Margaret held on and chose to hope anyway. They'd faced down blizzards and Victoria Ashford and small-town gossip. Maybe they could face this too. Maybe love wasn't about finding someone perfect. Maybe it was about finding someone whose broken pieces fit with yours. Someone willing to help you carry whatever burden the past had left you with. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats. But tonight, she was Margaret McCready, and she was not alone. The morning arrived too bright, too normal for what Margaret knew was coming. Jake had ridden out early to check the cattle, but she'd seen the way he'd strapped on his gun belt, the extra ammunition he'd tucked in his saddlebags. 3 days had passed since Crane's visit. 3 days of waiting for the other boot to drop. She was feeding the chickens when she heard the horses' too many horses for casual visitors. Her heart clenched as she recognized Crane at the head of 6 men, but it was the figure beside him that made her blood run cold. Sheriff Watson from Cedar Falls, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "Mrs. McCready," the sheriff called, his voice apologetic but firm. "I need you to step away from the house, ma'am." "Sheriff, what is this about?" Crane smiled coldly. "Those documents your father hid, they've raised some interesting questions. The sheriff here has a warrant to search your property." Margaret's hands clenched in her apron. "On what grounds?" "Suspicion of harboring stolen funds," Watson said, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but Mr. Crane's provided evidence that suggests this woman and her husband are sitting on $20,000 of my money." Crane interrupted. "Hidden somewhere on this ranch." "That's absurd. You have your documents." "Documents that prove the money existed, not where it went." Crane dismounted, his men following. "But don't worry, we'll find it." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone turn. Jake rode up fast, taking in the scene with one sweep of his gray eyes. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible but ready. "Sheriff, gentlemen," his voice was dangerously calm. "Mind explaining why you're trespassing?" Watson held up a folded paper. "Got a warrant. Jake, Judge Hammond signed it this morning." "Hammond?" Jake's mouth twisted. Crane must be paying well these days. "Watch your tongue, McCready," Crane warned. "Or maybe we'll be looking into your past next. Heard some interesting stories about your time in Missouri. Something about a situation in Kansas City." Jake went very still. Margaret had never seen him look dangerous before, but she saw it now, something cold and lethal in his stance. "Jake," she said quietly, moving to his side. "They have a warrant. Let them search. We have nothing to hide." For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Then the tension eased fractionally from his shoulders. "1 hour, he told the sheriff. "You've got 1 hour to conduct your search. Any damage to property, you'll answer for it." The search was thorough and humiliating. Crane's men tore through their carefully built life, upending Margaret's neat kitchen, pawing through her clothes, even digging up parts of her garden. Jake stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching with eyes like winter storms. It was one of Crane's men who found it, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under their bed, a canvas bag, heavy with gold coins. "No," Margaret breathed. "That's not, we didn't." $5,000. Crane counted, his satisfaction evident. "Not the full 20, but a good start. Sheriff, I believe you've seen enough." Watson looked troubled. "Jake, Margaret, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." "This is a setup," Jake said flatly. We've never seen that gold before. Maybe so, but the crack of a rifle cut through the morning air. One of Crane's horses screamed and bolted, its saddle blown apart. Everyone dove for cover as another shot followed. Then another. "What the hell?" Crane started. "That'd be me expressing my opinion of claim jumpers and liars." The voice came from the rise above the house. An old man emerged, lever-action rifle held casual but ready. Tom Morrison from the general store stood beside him, along with 4 other men Margaret recognized from town. "Tom," Watson called. "What are you doing here?" "Protecting neighbors from a snake," Tom replied. "See, Jake helped me out last winter when rustlers hit my store. Man who does that deserves the same in return." "This is legal business," Crane snarled. "Interfere and what?" Another voice, female this time. Sarah Morrison appeared, accompanied by 5 other women from the church social. Each carried a rifle with easy familiarity. "You'll have us arrested too. Good luck finding a jury in this county that'll convict." Jake moved then, swift as thought. His fist connected with Crane's jaw, sending the man sprawling. Before anyone could react, he'd pulled Crane's gun and tossed it aside. "Found that gold yourself, didn't you?" Jake said, standing over him. "Planted it to force us out. What'd Victoria Ashford pay you?" Crane spat blood. "You can't prove anything." "Don't have to." Jake hauled him to his feet. "Sheriff, you want to keep your job come next election because I'm betting these good folks have opinions about lawmen who do Crane's bidding." Watson looked between the armed townspeople and Crane's men, clearly calculating odds. "The gold was found on McCready property. That's fact. Also fact that Crane here's been bragging at Ashford's hotel about running Jake out." Tom Morrison said, "My boy heard him last night. Said he had a foolproof plan." "That true, Samuel?" Watson's eyes narrowed. "Because if it is—" The thunder of hooves interrupted him. 24 riders appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Jake tensed, then relaxed as he recognized the lead rider. "Colonel Thornton," he murmured. "I'll be damned." The riders were all veterans, Margaret realized. She could see it in their bearing, the way they moved as a unit. Their leader, a distinguished man with silver temples, dismounted near Jake. "McCready," he said simply. "Heard you might need some help." "Colonel," Jake's voice was thick with emotion. "It's been a while. Not so long I'd forget one of my best scouts." Thornton turned to the sheriff. "Whatever this man's accused of, I'll stand his bond. Any jury wants to hear why. I'll tell them how Jake McCready saved 40 men at Wilson's Creek, including me." The sheriff looked like a man watching his simple arrest turn into a war. "Mr. Crane, given the questions raised about this evidence, I think we'd better continue this investigation back in town." "This isn't over," Crane hissed at Jake. "You think these people can protect you forever?" Jake smiled then, cold as January wind. "Tell Victoria Ashford she picked the wrong enemy. And Crane, if I see you on my land again, warrant or no warrant, they'll be picking you up in pieces." As the sheriff led Crane and his men away, the townspeople began to disperse, but Colonel Thornton lingered, studying Margaret with keen eyes. "You'd be the wife I heard about, the one who stood up to Victoria Ashford at the church social." Yes." Margaret felt suddenly shy under that piercing gaze. "Good." He offered his hand like she was an equal. "Jake needs someone with backbone. God knows he's got enough ghosts to fight without facing them alone." After he'd gone, Jake and Margaret stood in their ransacked home, surveying the damage. Feathers from her torn pillows drifted like snow. Her carefully preserved garden lay in ruins. "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly. "This is my fault. My past—" "Our past," Margaret corrected. She picked up a scattered photograph, their wedding portrait. Glass cracked but image intact. "Both our pasts. But did you see the town came? They stood for us." "Tom Morrison's a good man. Remembered when I helped him out." "It's more than that." Margaret set the photograph carefully on the mantel. We're part of something now. Part of the community. That matters. Jake pulled her into his arms. When Thornton showed up, Margaret, there's things about the war, about what I did after. I wasn't always... Shh. She pressed her fingers to his lips. Tell me when you're ready. But Jake, whatever you did, whoever you were, you're the man who saved me from a blizzard. The man building a ranch and a life. That's who matters to me. He kissed her then, really kissed her for the first time since their wedding. Not the careful, respectful touches they'd shared, but something deeper, hungrier. Margaret responded with equal fervor, pouring all her fear and relief and growing love into the connection. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. We should start cleaning up, he said roughly. We should. But neither moved, holding each other in the wreckage of their home. Crane'll be back, Jake warned. This isn't over. Then we'll be ready. Margaret looked around at the chaos, then squared her shoulders. But first, we rebuild, and this time, we build it stronger. As they began putting their home back together, Margaret felt a fundamental shift in her understanding. This wasn't just about surviving anymore, or finding shelter from their pasts. This was about claiming their place, their right to be here, to build something worth defending. Outside, her scattered rose seeds lay mixed with overturned earth. She'd replant them tomorrow, she decided. And if Crane or Victoria or anyone else tried to tear them up again, they'd find out what a Philadelphia lady could do when she'd found something worth fighting for. The war for their future had begun. But for the first time since Crane's appearance, Margaret believed they might actually win it. The summer had been kind to them. After the confrontation with Crane, the town's support had only grown stronger. Orders for Jake's horses came steadily, and Margaret's garden, replanted with determined fury, now bloomed with vegetables and herbs. Even her prairie roses had taken root, sending up tentative green shoots that promised future beauty. It was a Sunday evening, the air finally cooling after a blazing day, when Jake found Margaret sitting on the porch steps they'd built together. She was mending one of his shirts, but her hands had stilled, her gaze distant across the valley. Wool gathering, he asked, settling beside her. Thinking about tomorrow, the barn raising. She smiled. Our first real building on the ranch. Been a long time coming. Jake picked up a pebble, rolling it between his fingers. Margaret, there's something... I know. She set down her sewing. You've been working up to it for weeks. Whatever it is, Jake, just say it. He was quiet for so long she thought he might have changed his mind. Then, voice low and rough. I killed a man once, not in the war, after. Margaret waited, knowing this was like coaxing a spooked horse. Any sudden movement might send him running. His name was William Hartley, Kansas City. 3 years after the war ended, he was... Jake's jaw worked. He was running a ring, selling information about veterans' widows to men who'd prey on them. Lonely women with death benefits, no protection. One of them was my cousin's wife. She killed herself after they took everything. Oh, Jake. I tracked him down, meant to turn him in, but when I found him... Jake's hands clenched. He laughed, said the law couldn't touch him. He had judges in his pocket. Said those women were asking for it, so desperate for attention they'd believe anything. Margaret reached for his hand, holding it tight. I shot him. The words came out flat. Right there in his fancy office. Didn't even think about it, just drew and fired. They couldn't prove murder. Too many people wanted him dead, but everyone knew. That's why I left Missouri. He deserved it, Margaret said fiercely. Jake turned to look at her, surprise flickering in his gray eyes. Most people would say killing's wrong no matter what. Most people haven't seen what desperate men do to vulnerable women. Margaret thought of her father, of Crane, of all the men who'd seen her as either prey or property. You protected those who couldn't protect themselves. That's not murder. Jake, That's justice. The law might disagree. The law let William Hartley prey on widows. Sometimes the law's wrong. Jake studied her face in the fading light. You really believe that? I believe in you. Margaret touched his cheek. I believe in the man who saved me from a blizzard, who's building something good here, who stood up to Crane even when it could have cost everything. I'm not a good man, Margaret. You're my man. She leaned into him. That's all that matters to me. He kissed her temple, then her cheek, then found her mouth in a kiss that tasted of gratitude and promise. When they parted, something had shifted between them, another wall down, another step closer to whatever they were building together. There's more, Jake said, about the war, about another time. Margaret stood, pulling him up with her. Tonight, let's just be Jake and Margaret. Tomorrow's soon enough for more confessions. But tomorrow came with its own surprises. The barn raising drew folks from miles around, ranchers, townspeople, even some Jake didn't recognize. It was how things were done out here. Margaret had learned. Today they'd raise Jake's barn. Next month they'd all gather for someone else's need. Margaret was organizing the food tables with the other women when she noticed the stranger. He sat apart from the workers, dressed too well for labor, watching Jake with an intensity that raised her hackles. Sarah, she murmured to her friend, do you know that man, the one in the gray vest? Sarah followed her gaze and frowned. Never seen him before. Came in on the morning stage. Tom said, asking questions about Jake. A chill ran down Margaret's spine despite the warm day. She was moving toward Jake when the stranger stood, intercepting her husband near the water barrel. Jake McCready, the man's voice carried despite its quiet tone. Or should I say Sergeant McCready? We need to talk. Jake stiffened, setting down his hammer with careful control. Do I know you? Paul Morrison, U.S. Marshal. He showed a badge briefly. I'm investigating some old business from the war. Your name came up. The barn raising continued around them, but Margaret saw how the nearest men had noticed the tension, how hands drifted closer to tool handles that could become weapons if needed. The war's been over 8 years, Jake said evenly. Whatever you're investigating, a massacre. 20 Confederate prisoners shot after surrendering. Word is you were part of the unit responsible. Margaret's breath caught. Jake's face had gone stone still, revealing nothing. That's a serious accusation. Marshal... It is. Man just got released from prison. One of your former unit. He's talking, trying to cut a deal. Says you gave the order. He's lying. Maybe. That's what I'm here to determine. Morrison glanced around at the gathered crowd, many now openly watching. We can do this publicly, or we can talk private-like. Your choice. Jake looked at Margaret, something desperate in his eyes. Then his shoulders squared. Nothing private about it, he said. Voice carrying, yes, I was there. No, I didn't give any order. Lieutenant Carson did that. I tried to stop it. That's not what Private Henley says. Henley was a coward and a thief. Jake stopped, visibly controlling himself. 20 boys, Marshal. Not soldiers anymore, just scared boys who dropped their guns. Carson said they were guerrillas, not regular army. Didn't deserve quarter. I said it was murder. The work had stopped now, everyone listening. Margaret moved to Jake's side, taking his arm. What happened then? Morrison pressed. I pulled my gun on Carson, told him I'd shoot him if he gave the order. He laughed, said I didn't have the stones. Jake's voice was raw. He was right. I couldn't shoot one of our own, not even to save those boys. Carson gave the order, and his bootlickers carried it out, including Henley. You did nothing. I reported it, got busted back to private for insubordination and sent to another unit. Jake's laugh was bitter. Carson got promoted. That's Army justice for you. Morrison studied him for a long moment. You got witnesses to back this up. I do. Everyone turned. Colonel Thornton stepped out from the crowd, several of his veterans behind him. I was Jake's commanding officer after the transfer. Thornton said, "I know why he was sent to me, and it wasn't for giving any massacre order. Boy requested a transfer to the most dangerous unit he could find, trying to die with honor because he couldn't live with what he'd seen." "That proves nothing about—" "I was there too." Another voice. A young man Margaret didn't recognize pushed forward. "Name's David Carson. Lieutenant Carson was my older brother." Jake went rigid. "David." "Jake tried to stop it. Marshal, I saw the whole thing. Was just a runner then. 15 years old. But I saw—" David's voice shook. "Saw Jake put his gun to my brother's head, begging him not to do it. Saw my brother laugh and do it anyway." "Why didn't you speak up before?" Morrison demanded. "Because he was my brother." David looked sick. "Because I was a coward. But when I heard Henley was trying to pin it on the one man who tried to do right, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Morrison was silent, processing. Around them, the crowd waited. "I'll need sworn statements," he said finally. "But based on what I'm hearing, Henley's story doesn't hold. Sergeant McCready, you'll need to stay available. But I see no reason to arrest you." As Morrison moved off to speak with the witnesses, Jake stood frozen, staring at David Carson. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. "Your brother was a monster." David's young face was old beyond its years. "You tried to save those boys. Jake, that matters. It's mattered to me every day since." The crowd began to disperse, work resuming with a different energy. Men who'd stood ready to defend Jake now pounded nails with renewed vigor. The barn would rise today, Margaret realized. But something else had risen to a final understanding of the man she'd married. That evening, as the barn stood complete against the sunset, Jake found Margaret by her rose bushes. The first bud had appeared, tiny but perfect. "You stayed," he said wonderingly. "Even after hearing all that, you stayed." "Where would I go?" Margaret touched the rosebud gently. "This is my home. You're my husband. Your past is part of you, but it doesn't define your future. I have nightmares sometimes about those boys. Then I'll hold you through them." She turned to face him. "Jake, you tried. In an impossible situation. You stood up for what was right. That's the man I married. That's the man I love." The word hung between them, finally spoken. Jake's eyes widened. "You love me." "I do." Margaret smiled through sudden tears. "Not the idea of you, not what you could be, but you, all of you, shadows and all." Jake pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "Margaret, I love you too. Have for weeks, maybe since that first night. But I thought, no more thinking." She pulled back to look at him. "No more waiting for the past to catch up. It came, we faced it, we're still standing. Now we build our future." As if in agreement, a sound drifted from the new barn. One of the men had brought out a fiddle, and music spilled into the evening air. Other instruments joined in, and suddenly there was an impromptu celebration happening. "Dance with me," Jake asked, echoing her request from months ago. This time they danced not in a cramped cabin but under the open sky, surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends, on land that was truly theirs. The prairie roses might be just beginning, but Margaret's heart was in full bloom. "You still owe me something," she said as they swayed together. "What's that?" "A ranch. You promised to build me a ranch if I warmed your bed." Jake's smile was tender and wicked all at once. "Seems to me I've been keeping my end. Question is, have you been keeping yours?" Margaret stood on her toes to whisper in his ear, words that made him crush her against him with a groan. "Soon as these folks leave," he promised roughly, "I'll show you just how warm our bed can be." The music played on. The barn stood strong against the darkening sky, and Margaret McCready danced with her husband on the land they'd claimed together. Tomorrow there would be cattle to tend, a house to finish, a life to build. Tonight, there was just this love acknowledged, past faced, future bright with possibility. It was enough. It was everything. The September morning dawned crisp and golden, perfect for a wedding. Not her first wedding that had been a hasty affair in a judge's parlor, but her real wedding. Margaret thought as Sarah Morrison helped her into the cream-colored dress they'd sewn together. 6 months, Sarah mused, pinning a spray of prairie roses in Margaret's hair. Hard to believe it's only been 6 months since you arrived. Through the window of the new house, their house, built with timber and sweat and neighbors' help, Margaret could see the transformation. Where once there'd been empty land, now stood a barn. Corrals, the beginning of their herd. The garden blazed with late summer flowers, and yes, her prairie roses had bloomed, defying all expectations. "Nervous?" Sarah asked. "No." Margaret smiled at her own reflection, seeing the woman she'd become, sun-touched, strong, sure. "We're already married. This is just a proper celebration, the one you deserve." Sarah squeezed her shoulders. "The whole county's here, you know, even Victoria Ashford." Margaret's smile turned wicked. "Good. Let her see what she missed." Outside, Jake waited by the apple trees. They'd planted mere saplings now, but full of promise. He wore his best suit, the one he'd bought in Cedar Falls, and Margaret's heart swelled at the sight of him. This man who'd saved her from the storm, who'd offered shelter and found love, who'd built her the life she'd never known she wanted. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony, but Margaret barely heard the words. She was lost in Jake's gray eyes, in the work-roughened hands that held hers so gently, in the smile that transformed his weathered face when he looked at her. "Do you, Margaret, take this man again to be your husband?" the Reverend asked with gentle humor. "I do," she said firmly, "today and every day." "And do you, Jake, take this woman to be your wife, to build with her a life on this land?" "Already have," Jake said, making their friends laugh. "But yes, I do. Always will." This time when they kissed, it was to thunderous applause and the music of 3 fiddles striking up a celebration tune. The party that followed filled their new yard with laughter and music. Tables groaned under the weight of food their neighbors had brought. Children ran between the dancers while their parents celebrated the success story of Jake and Margaret McCready, proof that the frontier could build lives, not just break them. "Dance with your wife," Colonel Thornton commanded Jake, pushing him toward where Margaret was helping serve pie. "Food can wait." Jake swept her into his arms, and they joined the swirling couples, dancing in daylight, with their community around them. On their own land, it was everything Margaret had never dared dream. "Happy?" Jake asked, echoing his question from months ago. "Beyond words." She leaned into him. "Though I have a confession. Another secret." But he was smiling. "I may have invited someone, a surprise." Jake's eyebrows rose. "Who?" Margaret Sinclair." They turned to see a young woman in traveling clothes, pretty despite the dust of the road. Margaret broke from Jake's arms with a cry of delight. "Charlotte." The women embraced, and Margaret found herself crying. Charlotte Pemberton had been her closest friend in Philadelphia, the only one who'd written after the scandal. "I can't believe you came." "Your letter made it sound like paradise." "I had to see for myself." Charlotte's eyes sparkled. "Besides, Philadelphia is dreadfully dull without you to scandalize society." Margaret introduced her to Jake, who shook hands with careful courtesy. "Welcome to our home," he said simply. "Any friend of Margaret's has a place here." As Charlotte was swept into the party, meeting neighbors and sampling food, Jake pulled Margaret aside. "You wrote to her to Philadelphia." "Just her. I needed one person from that life to see this life, to know I didn't just disappear. And if she'd brought trouble with her news of Crane or worse." Margaret looked up at him steadily. Then we'd have faced it, like we face everything together. Jake's expression softened. When did you get so wise? Somewhere between the blizzard and the barn raising. She stood on her toes to kiss him. We're not hiding anymore. Jake, either of us, this is our life, and I want to claim it fully. The party continued as the sun moved toward the horizon. Tom Morrison brought out his banjo, joining the fiddles. Colonel Thornton told stories that had everyone roaring with laughter. Even David Carson was there, quiet but smiling, having decided to stay in Cedar Falls and work at the bank a chance for his own fresh start. As twilight painted the sky purple and gold, Margaret found herself standing with Charlotte by the rose bushes, watching the celebration. You've changed, Charlotte said softly. The Margaret I knew could never have done this, built a life from nothing, faced down criminals, planted roses in the prairie. The Margaret you knew was sleeping, Margaret replied. It took a blizzard to wake her up. And him, Charlotte nodded toward Jake, who was helping set up lanterns for the evening dancing. He's not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone easier, gentler, more like William. Margaret's former fiancé's name no longer stung. William would have crumbled at the first hard wind out here. Jake is like the mountain solid, enduring, sheltering. He's exactly what I needed, even if I didn't know it. You love him. It wasn't a question. With everything I am, Margaret smiled. And miraculous as it seems, he loves me back. As full dark fell and the lanterns cast golden pools of light, Jake appeared at her elbow. May I borrow my wife? He asked Charlotte. There's something we need to do. He led Margaret to where Reverend Mills stood with a table holding a document and pen. The marriage register, the Reverend explained. For the church records? Thought you might want to sign it together. Margaret took the pen, writing her name with a flourish, Margaret Sinclair McCready. Jake signed below, his handwriting careful and clear. Now, Reverend Mills said loud enough for all to hear, I call on the community to witness. These two have built something from nothing, faced storms both natural and man-made, and chosen each other not once, but twice. Who stands with them? The roar of agreement made Margaret's eyes blur with tears. Everyone, ranchers, townspeople, former soldiers. Even some who'd been strangers 6 months ago called out their support. Then, by the power vested in me and the witness of this community, I declare what was already true. Jake and Margaret McCready are bound together in life, in work, and in love. What God and this land have joined, let no one tear asunder. The dancing resumed with renewed energy. Margaret found herself passed from partner to partner, Tom Morrison, Colonel Thornton, even young David Carson, who blushed through the entire reel. But always her eyes found Jake, and always he was watching her, waiting. Finally, as the moon rose full and bright, Jake reclaimed her. The musicians had shifted to slower tunes, and couples swayed together under the stars. Remember our first dance? Jake murmured against her hair. In the cabin, no music, barely room to move. I remember everything about those first days. Margaret pressed closer to him. How scared I was. How certain you'd send me away once the storm passed. Never crossed my mind. His arms tightened. Minute I saw you in that snow, fighting to live, I knew you belonged here. Because I'd warm your bed. She felt him smile. Because you had steel in you, just needed the right forge to shape it. And you needed someone to see past the shadows? Maybe that's what love is. Jake mused. Finding someone who sees your worst and chooses to stay anyway. Then we've got it in abundance. Margaret pulled back to look at him. Jake McCready, you promised to build me a ranch. He gestured at the buildings, the land, the celebrating community. Have I kept my promise? Beyond my wildest dreams, she smiled, slow and full of promise. Now about my part of the bargain. The bed warming. His eyes darkened. How am I doing there? Well, she said thoughtfully. It's been a warm summer. Haven't needed much bed warming. Winter's coming, Jake reminded her. Voice rough. Long, cold nights ahead. Then I suppose I'd better stay. For warmth. Just warmth. Margaret stood on her toes to whisper in his ear. For everything. Jake, forever. As if in blessing. A sound drifted across the valley, cattle lowing. Horses nickering, the night birds calling. The sounds of home. Of the life they'd built from a chance meeting in a blizzard. The party would continue for hours yet, but Jake and Margaret slipped away. Fingers entwined. Hearts full. Behind them, the lanterns bobbed like earthbound stars. Ahead lay their house, their bed, their future. No regrets? Jake asked as they paused on their own threshold. Margaret thought of Philadelphia, of the girl she'd been, of all the paths that had led to this moment. Then she looked at her husband, this good, complicated man who'd offered her shelter and found his own heart's home. Not one, she said, and meant it. Jake swept her into his arms, carrying her over the threshold as he hadn't their first wedding night. This time there was no awkwardness. No uncertainty, just the promise made real. You'll warm my bed tonight, he said against her lips. And I'll build you a ranch tomorrow. You already have, Margaret laughed. So what will you build me next? Jake's smile was everything love and heat and promise. How about a life day by day, season by season? You and me and whatever comes. Deal, Margaret said, and kissed him. Outside, the music played on, celebrating not just a wedding but a victory over the past, over doubt, over everyone who'd said two damaged souls couldn't build something whole. The prairie roses bloomed in the moonlight, proof that beauty could grow in impossible places. And in the house that Jake built, in the bed that Margaret warmed, two hearts that had found each other in a storm settled in for all the seasons to come. Knowing that the strongest foundations weren't made of wood or stone, but of trust, forgiveness, and the daily choice to love. The end. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share what touched your heart in this story of Margaret and Jake McCready.